welcome to the Blue Wall Guitar Room, and this is the fourth video in this series of lessons in which I'm outlining how and why I like to incorporate a few arpeggios into scale-based solos. And just in case you haven't seen the previous videos, the main reason is because scales, even pentatonic scales, contain a number of consecutive notes. And so when we solo using those scales, we inevitably end up playing a number of licks with consecutive notes. Whereas even with a basic 3-note major or minor arpeggio, there are no consecutive notes. So I find that incorporating a few arpeggios which have wider note intervals into a solo can add a sound and a feel which I probably wouldn't get using just scales. So in the previous lesson we looked at major and dominant arpeggios based around a C chord shape with an A string root. So in this lesson we'll be looking at a minor arpeggio based on an A minor chord shape, also with an A string root. Now I'm sure you all know this minor chord shape, which has the root note on the A string. So this chord, for example, is E minor because the note we're playing on the A string is E. And if we now take the fourth finger off the G string and place it on the 10th fret of the top E, it becomes an E minor 7 chord. And this is the chord shape we'll be basing our minor 7 arpeggio on. So let's look at a minor 7 arpeggio fingering pattern based around this chord shape. So we'll start with the E at the 7th fret of the A string, G at the 10th fret of the A string, B at the 9th fret of the D string, D at the 7th fret of the G string, E at the 9th fret of the G string, G at the 8th fret of the B string, B at the 7th fret of the top E string, and D at the 10th fret of the top E string. Okay, so we now have a minor 7 fingering pattern, and because we're playing it from an E note root, it's an E minor 7 arpeggio, and of course we can just move it around. So if we take it down 2 frets for argument's sake, it becomes a D minor 7 arpeggio. Okay, so before we look at how and where we can use this minor 7 arpeggio, let's look at a few licks based around this minor 7 arpeggio fingering pattern. So for lick number 1, we're just playing straight through the arpeggio. And then when we get to the B note on the 7th fret of the top E, we're then going to go chromatically up to the D note. And then when we get to the D note, we're going to come back to the B, but rather than just playing the B straight, we're going to slide into it, and then we'll land on the G at the 8th fret of the B string. And lick number 2 is very similar, except in this case we're adding even more chromatics in. So we're playing from the root up to the E note on the G string, and then once we hit that E note, we're then going back down chromatically to the D, and then going across to the G note on the 8th fret of the B string, and then we're playing the same chromatic run we did in the first lick. Okay, so as we saw in the last video, you don't always have to play the entire arpeggio right across the fretboard. We can actually play just parts of it. So for example, rather than playing, you could just play just on the top 3 strings. Now for this next lick, we're going to be starting on the G note at the 10th fret of the A string, and we're going to be going across through the arpeggio Now when we get to the top E string, we'll be hammering on from the B to the D and pulling off, and then playing the D and bending it up to an E. Needless to say, there are many more licks within this arpeggio shape, so please experiment with it and find the licks that work really well for you. Okay, so we know that we can use these E minor 7 arpeggio licks over an E minor chord, but what else can we do with them? Well, one of the things that I like to do is superimpose arpeggios over other chords. For example, I might play an E minor 7 arpeggio over a C major chord. So let's look at why that works and what other chords we could play it over. So now let's look at a C major scale. And now let's build a triad, i.e. a 3-note chord from each note of that scale. And to do that, we need to start on each note in turn and then add the 3rd note from that note and the 5th. So for example, if we start on the C, then count up 3, that note is E, and if we start on C again and count up 5, that note is G. So C, E, and G is the triad that we have built on the C note, and C, E, and G gives us a C major triad. Similarly, if we start on the D note and count up 3, we get F, and if we then count up 5, we get A. So D, F and A is the triad based off the D note in this key. In this case, so D, F and A is D minor. And if we take that principle and apply it to every note in the C major scale, we get C major, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished, and C. Okay, so we're going to be treating the E minor chord as the 3rd chord in the key of C major. So this means that we can use our E minor 7 arpeggio over some of the other chords within the key of C major. So let's start with a basic C major chord, which has the notes C, E and G. Now if we extend that up to, let's say, a C major 9 chord, that has the notes C, E, G, B and D. And you'll now see that all 4 notes of our E minor 7 arpeggio are actually in the C major 9 chord, which means we can use the E minor 7 arpeggio over any variation of a C major chord. In other words, a C major 6, C major 7, C major 9th, etc. So when we play an E minor 7 arpeggio over a C major chord, we're actually playing notes from a C major 9 arpeggio. So we know that we can play our E minor 7 arpeggio bass licks over any variation of a C major chord. And as we saw in one of the previous lessons, every major chord has a relative minor. So for C major, the relative minor is A minor. So this means that we should be able to play our E minor 7 arpeggio licks over an A minor chord. So if we just look at the notes in an A minor triad, it's A, C and E. Now if we extend that up to an A minor 11 chord, the notes are A, C, E, G, B and D. So as you can see, the top 4 notes in that chord are the same 4 notes as we have in our E minor 7 arpeggio. So therefore, when we play an E minor 7 arpeggio over an A minor chord, we're actually spelling out the notes of an A minor 11 arpeggio. So the last chord we'll try the E minor 7 arpeggio over is G major, and that has the notes G, B and D. And if we extend that to a G major 6 chord, the notes are G, B, D and E. And you'll see that they're exactly the same notes as we have in our E minor 7 arpeggio, just in a different order. So when we play the E minor 7 arpeggio over a G major chord, we're actually playing the notes of a G major 6 arpeggio. So by superimposing our E minor 7 arpeggio over different chords, we're actually creating the sound of other arpeggios. Okay, so there's quite a lot of information to take in there, so let's have a quick recap. Firstly, we started off with our E minor 7 arpeggio. We then determined that E minor was actually the 3rd chord in the key of C major, and so we tried to superimpose our E minor 7 arpeggio over some of the other chords from that same key. And we found that when we played E minor 7 over a C major chord, we were actually playing notes from a C major 9. When we then played the E minor 7 over an A minor chord, we found that we were actually playing notes from an A minor 11 chord. And when we played the E minor 7 arpeggio over a G major chord, we found that we were actually playing exactly the same notes of a G major 6 chord. So in this next video clip, I'll be improvising over a C major to A minor to D minor to G7 chord sequence, and I'll try and incorporate some of the arpeggio ideas that we've covered in these last 4 video lessons. So hopefully you can now see that we don't just have to use arpeggios over the chord they're derived from, we can actually superimpose them over other chords, particularly from the same key, and that can be a very effective way of adding some extra colour to your soloing. Now I really hope you found this video useful, and if you have, please like and subscribe to my channel, and thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.